In the early years of the Cold War, the world was divided not just by borders, but by secrets. Nations raced to outpace each other in weapons, intelligence, and technology. The United States, fearful of Soviet advances in both nuclear weapons and aircraft, launched a series of highly classified experiments. Among the most unusual of these was Project Rainbow, a program dedicated to a seemingly impossible goal: making airplanes invisible. The project began in the late 1940s and continued through the early 1950s. At its core was a simple question: could humans alter light and radar to make a physical object disappear, or at least appear to vanish from the sky? For the U.S. Air Force, the stakes were immense. If successful, American aircraft could penetrate enemy airspace undetected, gaining a decisive advantage in intelligence gathering, bombing missions, and reconnaissance. The problem, however, was not simple. At the time, aircraft were detected visually, through radar, and even with primitive infrared systems. Making a plane invisible required confronting physics itself. The scientists and engineers assigned to Project Rainbow faced an unprecedented challenge. They had to experiment with reflective materials, experimental paints, coatings, and even mirrored surfaces, while simultaneously testing radar-absorbent designs. One of the first planes selected for experimentation was the B-29 Superfortress, a large bomber that had proven its capabilities in World War II. Engineers applied a series of treatments to its fuselage, including matte paints, light reflective coatings, and specialized silvery finishes designed to reflect sunlight in a way that would make the aircraft blend with the sky. They measured the effects under a variety of conditions: sunny days, overcast skies, and against radar detection equipment. Photographs from the era show engineers crouched over the plane, carefully brushing layers of experimental paint onto the wings and fuselage. Other images depict the aircraft suspended in wind tunnels, with sensors recording how light and radar waves interacted with the new coatings. Every detail was measured, every anomaly documented. These images are among the only surviving records of the program, giving historians today a glimpse into the bizarre experiments of a long-forgotten era. But visual camouflage was only half the battle. The U.S. Air Force was deeply concerned about radar detection. In 1949, radar technology had advanced rapidly. Large radar arrays could detect bombers at hundreds of miles. Project Rainbow engineers theorized that altering the plane's shape, angling its surfaces, and applying specific coatings might reduce radar reflections, effectively making the aircraft stealthy. It was decades before stealth aircraft like the F-117 would finally turn theory into practice. To test these ideas, experimental B-29s and other aircraft were flown over restricted test ranges in New Mexico and Nevada. Surveillance radars monitored their profiles, and engineers compared them against control planes without coatings. Some experiments showed marginal reductions in radar signatures, but none achieved true invisibility. The results were inconclusive, yet the Air Force pressed forward, driven by the fear of Soviet advancements. Project Rainbow also experimented with metallic foils and reflective panels. Engineers theorized that by applying reflective surfaces to specific parts of the aircraft, light could be bounced in a way that disrupted visual detection. In photographs, these test planes appear almost otherworldly, with shiny patchwork surfaces glinting in the sun. Pilots reported that from the ground, under certain angles, the aircraft could almost seem to vanish, blending into clouds and sunlight. The effect, however, was inconsistent and depended heavily on weather, sun position, and the observer's distance. Another curious aspect of Project Rainbow was its interest in infrared and heat signatures. Early infrared cameras were deployed to track the heat of the engines and fuselage. Engineers experimented with cooling systems, reflective coatings, and airflow modifications, attempting to reduce the thermal profile of aircraft. This work foreshadowed later developments in stealth technology, particularly infrared suppression techniques used in modern military aircraft. Despite decades of experimentation, Project Rainbow faced insurmountable challenges. Aircraft were too large, coatings were inconsistent, and radar technology continued to advance. By the mid-1950s, the program was quietly terminated, classified as a failure. Documents detailing the experiments were locked away in secure archives, and only fragments survived in declassified photos and technical reports. Yet Project Rainbow left a lasting legacy. The concept of reducing visual and radar detectability influenced later Cold War programs, including the development of the F-117 Nighthawk and the stealth bomber. Decades later, engineers who had worked on Rainbow carried lessons forward, experimenting with materials, angles, and surfaces that would eventually make true stealth aircraft possible. The photographs that remain tell a story of ambition and audacity. Black and white images show engineers in white lab coats examining wings, while other photos capture test planes in flight over the deserts of the American Southwest. In some, the planes seem almost surreal, their patched, silvery surfaces glinting under the sun. These images remind us of a time when humans dared to imagine bending light and technology in ways that seemed impossible. Project Rainbow also highlights the mindset of the early Cold War. Fear, secrecy, and competition drove the United States to pursue extraordinary ideas, sometimes bordering on science fiction. The program represents a fascinating intersection of imagination, physics, and military necessity, a chapter in history almost entirely forgotten, yet deeply influential. In retrospect, the challenges were immense. The technology simply was not ready. Radar and visual detection systems continued to improve, and coatings and materials lacked the sophistication to achieve invisibility. But the effort demonstrated a willingness to push the boundaries of possibility, to experiment with the impossible in pursuit of national security. Today, Project Rainbow stands as a symbol of Cold War ingenuity. Its influence is seen not in aircraft that vanished, but in the principles that guided modern stealth technology. Engineers learned that combining materials, science, aerodynamics, and careful observation could yield results far beyond what a single technology could achieve. The story of Project Rainbow reminds us that history is filled with ambitious, sometimes strange, experiments that never reach fruition but shape the future in unseen ways. The planes never disappeared from sight, but the ideas they generated continue to resonate in the technology of the present. These archival photos, preserved for decades, show us a moment in time when humans dared to chase invisibility, armed only with paintbrushes, calculators, and a deep conviction that the impossible might one day be possible. They reveal the creativity, determination, and sometimes obsession that characterized the early Cold War, a period defined not only by fear and secrecy, but by a relentless drive to explore, experiment, and innovate. In the end, Project Rainbow was never about failure or success in the conventional sense. It was about pushing the limits of knowledge, testing ideas that might one day change the battlefield. And while the planes never vanished from the skies, the project itself disappeared into history, leaving behind only photographs, reports, and a legacy that quietly influenced the next generations of engineers and military strategists. Every plane that flew, every photo taken, every coating tested was a step toward the invisible aircraft of the future. And though the public may never have known, these experiments were the foundation of technologies that now define modern air warfare. Project Rainbow remains a testament to human imagination, Cold War urgency, and the strange, fascinating paths that innovation can take when necessity meets curiosity. It is a story of ambition, secrecy, and vision, a forgotten project that once sought to do the impossible, to make airplanes disappear.